If I think about the economic policies of the Trump administration so far, and let's caveat all this with it hasn't even been 2 months yet. Right? It's been fewer than 2 months.
Feels longer than that.
And we are still trying to sort this out. But if I think them through, the two major things that I think of, A, are tariffs, and B, are government reforms focused on spending and taxes, right? That's where it comes down to. I think a lot of it's about efficiency and plenty more about DEI and other focuses of the administration, but that's not economics. Like I'm focused on these two. And the administration has been making an argument. Scott Bessent has been making it. President Trump has been making it. Many others have been as well. That when laid out concisely, I think makes a lot of sense. And so I'm going to attempt to lay out the economic reform and government reform side of that equation. Put simply, the United States government, over the course of the last 30 years, but especially over the course of the last few, has been spending like it is going out of style. If you take a look at government spending, deficits as a percentage of GDP over the course of the last few years, they've been averaging somewhere around 3%, which many would have said years ago was unsustainable. But over the course of the post-COVID period, accelerated to something like 6%.
Right.
And so, in my opinion at least, an economy that might have faced recession in 2022, 2023, 2024, that was largely sidestepped because, frankly, it's tough to have a downturn in unemployment in the market when there is so much government spending pouring into the economy still, right? It didn't take, in 2023 and 4, it might not have taken the form of stimulus payments, but, you had the giant CHIPS Act, you had the Inflation Reduction Act, and all of these things led to big U.S. government deficits. And the incoming administration has said, look, that is not a sustainable path to be on, right? If you are worried about the full faith and credit of the United States government, if you are concerned about, long-term inflation, that needs to be reined in. And I have to say, I agree on that entirely. And I don't know if you do it by cutting government spending, by raising taxes, but the net deficit, right, the net spending number from the United States government probably should not be sustained at 6% a year, because I think ultimately it leads to a crisis at some point in the future. No idea what that looks like. I think better trained people than I am would have a better idea of it than I would. And in my opinion, it may even be worth going through a recession in order to deal with that problem.
I would agree. I would agree with all those facts there.
Like, again, the problem with what you're describing here is if it were to continue at that pace, someday it might lead to a much larger disruption. And I think that's what Scott Bessent has pointed out is, hey, I'd rather deal with a short-term recession to get government spending under control than 15 years from now have a bunch of nations that no longer want to buy U.S. debt because it's not as powerful and strong as it once was. It's no longer the reserve currency, and that's the fight that we are trying to head off with our changes to government policy when it comes to deficits.
Agreed. The problem, which you probably were getting to, is this idea that while that in its essence I couldn't be more in agreement with, this idea that we need to get the deficit under control, that we have way too much debt as a country. I think many people would agree to that. There's very few people who would disagree with the levels of debt right now being tenable.
Whether people are willing to go through a recession to deal with that problem,
that's a different
question. But I think most people would agree with that fundamental piece of, hey, I wouldn't manage my household this way. You probably shouldn't manage a country this way. And it needs to be addressed.
But from a policy perspective, what you've seen, and again, you're right, it has been a very short span of time here, but the efforts of the Department of Government Efficiency, the areas that they are targeting, while the message and the idea behind it, or at least you and I agree with this idea, cutting down government spending, I'm behind that. But the items that you have to go after are big ticket items that no one really feels comfortable going with from a political perspective. That's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid has been one that's been bantered about, and defense spending. Those are four of the biggest areas that you need to target. Those have not been touched. They're very difficult to touch. And then you combine that with this idea that we're coming up on the looming deadline for the 2017 tax cuts. all of us have collectively benefited from lower tax rates over the course of the last 8 years or so. Those are set to sunset at the end of 2025.
Yep.
If nothing were to happen, they were to revert back to their prior levels. However, a lot of the discussion around this administration coming in is keeping those in and reinstituting them for a longer period of time. Just doing that, just the signature of instituting those in for a longer period of time, as much as you and I would benefit, and I would love to see the rates where they are because they've been really low relative to historical norms, it's going to add trillions of dollars to the deficit. So in one end, you have actions being taken to cut down on the deficit by cutting out some areas of the government that there probably is excess spending. But that's like looking at your household budget, and let's say someone spends $100,000 and you're starting to target, well, maybe here or there, I won't go after.
Got to cut out the avocado toast.
I won't, get coffee, twice a week. And instead of ignoring, your mortgage payment and your car payments, like that's kind of the efforts that we've seen recently, particularly if you're going to reinstitute the tax cuts.
I'm going to remain open-minded, right? I'll judge this in a few years
Right.
when we see where it goes. I agree with you to this point. Like, you cut 10,000 employees from Social Security. Yeah, I mean, that's not going to do the same thing as making giant cuts to Medicare and the program of Social Security itself. And so is it actually meaningful? We'll have to wait and see. The problem that you've seen in markets has not been related to that to this point, right? You have not seen a big uptick in unemployment to this point in reaction to that. The problem that you have seen in markets has everything to do with tariffs. And when you layer on that side of the equation, that's where I start to get lost, and that's where I think American CEOs and others are starting to get lost as well, is what role do tariffs play in this overall new view of the economy? Is it that they are there to reduce the deficits further? Is it that they are there to drive a better bargain on trade because we've been getting screwed over on trade by our global partners for the last 30 years, 50 years? Is it to bring jobs back to the United States, and what will that do to help with deficits and economic growth over the long term? Those, I think, are the open questions that just has a lot of people, and clearly a lot of market participants, as displayed by today's sell-off, confused as to where exactly all of this goes.